Clara Whitfield pressed her back against the cold stable wall and bit down hard on her lip so nobody would hear her cry. She had just served dinner to 30 guests who looked straight through her like she was made of glass. 24 years old, no husband, no money, no name worth mentioning. She was furniture in a house that didn't belong to her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the most powerful man in all of Virginia was standing in the shadows of that very stable, and he had been watching her for weeks. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 arrived in Whitmore Valley the way bad news always did, quietly without warning, wrapped in something that almost looked like beauty. The heat pressed down on the red clay roads and the wide tobacco fields and the white fences that lined the property of Ashbury Manor like the whole world had decided to hold its breath. Cicadas screamed from the oak trees. The James River moved slow and brown in the distance. And somewhere in the middle of all that southern splendor, Clara Whitfield stood in a kitchen that didn't belong to her, arranging flowers that would never be for her, for a dinner table she would never sit at. She was 24 years old that summer. Brown hair that never quite stayed pinned. Hands that were rougher than they ought to be for a woman of her education. Eyes the color of creek water, gray-green and still and deep. The kind of eyes that noticed everything and said almost nothing. She had lived at Ashbury Manor for 4 years, long enough to know exactly which floorboards creaked, which guests drank too much at supper, which kitchen girl cried on Sunday mornings, and which rooms in the house held secrets behind their closed doors. She had not been invited to live at Ashbury Manor. She had arrived because her father died and left nothing behind but debts and an old Bible, with her name written inside the cover, and her Aunt Margaret, her mother's older sister, mistress of Ashbury Manor, wife of the prosperous Edmund Hartley, had sent a single carriage and a single letter that said in neat cold script, "You may come. You will be useful. Not you are welcome. Not we want you here. You will be useful." And useful she had been. 4 years of it. Setting tables and mending dresses and reading correspondence aloud to her aunt when Margaret's eyesight gave her trouble, and entertaining the children of guests when their mothers wanted to be entertained themselves, and smiling at people who talked around her like she wasn't standing 3 feet away. She had become very good at disappearing while still being present. It was a particular kind of skill that nobody ever complimented you on. That evening, the evening that would change everything. Though Clara had no way of knowing it yet, Ashbury Manor was preparing for the most important dinner party of the summer season. Margaret Hartley had spent 3 weeks planning it. New candles ordered from Philadelphia. The good silver polished twice. 2 extra kitchen girls hired for the week. A menu written out in Margaret's own hand and pinned above the fireplace like a military order. Because Nathaniel Whitmore was coming. The name alone was enough to make the whole county stand up straighter. Nathaniel Whitmore, 33 years old. Owner of Whitmore Plantation, the largest private landholding in the Shenandoah Valley. 12,000 acres of timber and tobacco and river bottom land, so fertile that men in Richmond spoke of it with a kind of reverence that ought to have been reserved for things holy. He sat on the county court. He had the ear of the state legislature. When Nathaniel Whitmore spoke, people in 4 counties listened. He had never married. That fact alone made every family in Whitmore Valley with a daughter of marriageable age behave as though the second coming were imminent. "Clara," Margaret's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "The chrysanthemums on the center table are leaning to the left. Fix them." "Yes, Aunt Margaret." "And change that dress before the guests arrive. You look like a field hand." Clara looked down at her dress. It was clean. It was pressed. It was the best she owned. But she said nothing. She went and fixed the chrysanthemums, and she went upstairs, and she changed into the gray dress. The nicer gray, the one with the small white buttons at the collar, and she came back down and took her place near the far end of the hallway where she would be available if needed and invisible if not. She had perfected the art of being both at the same time. The guests arrived in a procession of carriages and candlelight and loud, confident voices. Clara watched from her position near the hallway as the Whitmore Valley families filed through the front door, the Carters, with their daughter Elizabeth 18 and golden-haired and fully aware of it. The Aldridges, whose son had just come back from a business venture in Boston. The Pembertons, who owned the mill on the eastern side of the river, and had been pretending for 20 years that they were finer people than they were. Margaret greeted each family with a warmth that Clara had never personally received. "Thomas, how wonderful. And Elizabeth, you look like a painting darling. Simply exquisite." Elizabeth Carter did look like a painting. She stood in the doorway in yellow silk, her blonde curls arranged just so, her smile calibrated to be pretty without trying. She was everything a Virginia landowner was supposed to want in a wife, well-bred, well-dowried, decorative, and thoroughly trained to agree with whatever was said to her. Clara watched her and felt something she worked very hard not to call loneliness. The carriage that arrived last came without fanfare. That was the first thing Clara noticed. No outriders, no footmen calling ahead, no particular ceremony. Just a plain black carriage with plain brass hardware, and a man who stepped down from it without waiting for assistance, and stood for a moment in the summer night air as though he was taking stock of something. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she expected, dark hair cut plain. He wore a good coat but not a showy one. His boots were the boots of a man who actually walked in them. Clara watched him the way she watched everything from a distance, quietly filing away details without quite knowing why. Margaret swept toward him with her most brilliant smile. "Mr. Whitmore, we are so honored." "Mrs. Hartley." His voice was low and even. He took her hand and bowed over it with the correct degree of courtesy, neither warm nor cold, practiced, precise. "The honor is mine. You know the Carters, of course, Thomas and his daughter Elizabeth." Something passed across Nathaniel Whitmore's face when he looked at Elizabeth Carter. Not displeasure, not pleasure. Something more like recognition, the look a man gets when he sees exactly what he expected to see and finds he was not wrong to expect it. "Miss Carter." A bow, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You are looking well." Elizabeth's smile blazed like a lit match. "Mr. Whitmore, we have all been so hoping you would come." We, Clara thought. The universal we. The room full of people who all want the same thing from this man and have all agreed to pretend they don't. She pressed herself back against the hallway wall as the party moved into the dining room. Her job now was to be available to fetch things, to carry messages, to refill things that ran low. Not to be seen, not to speak unless spoken to. She was very good at this. Dinner progressed, the way these dinners always did, loud in a way that was supposed to sound cultured, competitive, in a way that was supposed to sound friendly. Clara moved in and out of the dining room with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She refilled the water pitcher. She brought the extra bread. She caught the eye of the kitchen girl and sent her for more candles without making a sound. At one point, she passed directly behind Nathaniel Whitmore's chair to reach the sideboard. He turned his head just slightly and looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was to say, not at all. He actually looked. A brief, assessing glance, the kind of look that took in more than it appeared to. Clara met his eyes for exactly 1 second before she looked away the way she'd learned to do. You didn't hold the gaze of the most powerful man in the county. You didn't invite that kind of attention when you had no standing to absorb its consequences. She fetched the candles and went back to her place in the hallway. She told herself she had imagined it. After dinner, the guests drifted toward the parlor and the wide back veranda where the evening air had finally begun to cool. Margaret held court near the fireplace. The men gathered at one end of the room with their brandy and their opinions. Elizabeth Carter positioned herself with mathematical precision in the exact spot where Nathaniel Whitmore would most naturally look when he entered. Clara slipped out through the kitchen door. She needed air. She always needed air after one of these evenings, after hours of being present without being seen, of listening to conversations she wasn't part of watching people consume her aunt's hospitality, without once asking whether the woman who'd helped arrange all of it might like to sit down. She walked across the kitchen yard, past the herb garden, and into the stable. It was quieter there. The horses shifted and breathed in the dark. It smelled like hay and warm animal and old wood. Clara leaned against the stall door of the big bay mare, her favorite a horse named Prudence, who had a habit of pressing her nose against Clara's shoulder in a way that felt absurdly like comfort. "You're the only one around here who doesn't want something from me," Clara said quietly. Prudence pressed her nose harder. "I appreciate that about you. That's a remarkable claim," a man's voice said from the shadows near the stable entrance. "Given that she looks like she'd very much like an apple." Clara spun around. Nathaniel Whitmore stood just inside the stable door. He'd taken off his coat. It was draped over his arm, and he was standing there in his shirt sleeves like it was the most natural thing in the world for the wealthiest man in the county to be lurking in someone else's stable at 9 o'clock in the evening. Clara's first instinct was to apologize. Her second instinct was to wonder why she was always apologizing. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry I didn't know anyone was in here. I'll go." "Why?" He stepped further into the stable, and his voice was genuinely curious rather than challenging. "You weren't doing anything wrong." "I was. I needed some air." "So did I." He looked at Prudence, who had swiveled her large head toward him with the mild interest horses showed toward new humans. "May I?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small withered apple, the kind you carried because you'd brought it for exactly this purpose. He held it out flat on his palm, and Prudence took it with the dignified efficiency of a horse who knew her worth. "She trusts you," Clara said before she thought not to. "She trusts the apple." "No." Clara shook her head. "The apple is just how she decides to check. She was watching you for a full 10 seconds before she took it. If she didn't like what she saw, she'd have turned away." He looked at her, then the same look from the dining room, the one that actually landed. "You know horses." "I know that horse. I've been living here 4 years. You're Mrs. Hartley's niece, her husband's deceased cousin's daughter." Clara said it flatly, because that was the flattest way to say it. "The distinction matters to my aunt." Something shifted in his expression. He looked back at Prudence, who was investigating the palm of his hand for additional apples. "I noticed you at dinner." Clara felt a small, unhelpful flutter of something she recognized as the beginning of hope, and immediately suppressed it. "I was serving." "I know. You were also the only person in that room who looked at anyone else when they were speaking." He paused. "Everyone else was watching me." The directness of that stopped her. "You notice that? It's hard not to notice when you've spent 15 years being looked at for reasons that have nothing to do with you." He said it without self-pity, the way a man states a fact about the weather. "You refilled 3 water glasses that their owners hadn't touched. You signaled to the kitchen girl with a look. You caught the Aldridge boy's sleeve before he knocked the wine server over so quietly that no one else saw you do it." Clara stared at him. "You were watching me." "I was watching the room." A pause. "You were the most interesting person in it." She did not know what to do with that sentence. Nobody in 4 years had said anything remotely like it to her, and her first instinct was to distrust it completely, because things like that were said to girls like Elizabeth Carter, not to women like her. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "if my aunt sent you out here to—" "Your aunt doesn't know I'm out here. I doubt she'd approve." He looked almost amused. "I came out because I couldn't breathe in that parlor." "No." "Do you know how many times Elizabeth Carter mentioned her father's property in the last hour?" "I wasn't in the parlor." 4 times. In 1 hour. In 3 different ways." He looked at Prudence. "She's a lovely girl. She'd make a perfectly manageable wife, and I'd rather walk barefoot to Richmond than spend my life having that conversation." Clara pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. It wasn't a thing to smile at. It was none of her business. That's an unkind thing to say about her. "Is it untrue?" "It's—" She stopped. "No, but unkind and untrue aren't the same thing." He looked at her with sudden, undisguised interest. No, they're not. Most people don't make that distinction. Most people don't say unkind things out loud. You're right. He dipped his head slightly, conceding the point. I apologize. The apology surprised her more than anything else. Men like Nathaniel Whitmore did not apologize to women like Clara Whitfield. The structure of their world didn't require it. She looked at him in the stable's low light and tried to understand what was happening, and found she could not. I should go back inside, she said. Probably. He didn't move to stop her. What's your name? Your aunt called you Clara. Clara Whitfield. Nathan, he said. Just the one name easy and unremarkable, like a man introducing himself at a tavern counter rather than a dinner party. I hope we'll have occasion to speak again, Miss Whitfield. She left the stable. She walked back across the kitchen yard and in through the side door and up to her small room at the back of the house, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and told herself with great firmness not to think about any of it. She thought about all of it anyway. 3 days later, Nathan Gray arrived at Ashbury Manor with a letter of introduction and a quiet manner, and the stated purpose of surveying the eastern fence line on behalf of a land consortium he declined to name. Margaret Hartley received him briefly, assessed him as a person of no social consequence, and instructed the stablemaster to let him use the south paddock as a base. She did not invite him to dinner. She did not introduce him to the family. He was in her precise taxonomy of persons a useful nobody. Clara was the one who brought him the water bucket when he was working on the fence posts in the mid-morning heat. She was the one who noticed he was alone and offered to show him which section of the property line had been repaired last season, because otherwise he'd waste half a day measuring something that was already settled. She also noticed, in the same quiet way she noticed everything, that he was the man from the stable. The man who had told her she was the most interesting person in the room. She was not sure what to do with that knowledge, so she set it aside, the way she set aside most things that she did not know how to deal with. And she showed him the fence line, and she answered his questions about the property. In the practical, detailed way, she answered everything, because 4 years of managing the particulars of a household she didn't own had taught her more about land management than most men half tried to know. You know this property well, he said. I know most things that nobody thinks are worth knowing. He looked at her sideways. Why do you say it like that? Like what? Like it's a failing. Clara was quiet for a moment. They were walking along the fence line at the edge of the east pasture, the summer heat sitting heavy and golden on the grass. Because in this house, she said finally, the things worth knowing are the social things. Who's calling on whom? What the Aldridge family's plans are for their mill, whether the Carters have enough standing to be worth cultivating. She paused. Whether the fence posts have rotted is not a topic that gets you invited to sit at the table. It gets you a working fence, he said. That seems more useful. Useful. She repeated the word without inflection. Yes, that's the word for it. He heard something in it. She could tell he did the slight shift in his expression, the way he chose his next words more carefully. I don't think that's the worst thing a person can be. It depends entirely on whether you want to be a person or a tool. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the pasture. That's a hard way to live. It's the way I live. She stopped at the corner post and checked the rail. This section is fine. The rot was on the west side, 2 posts north of the gate. Miss Whitfield. She looked up. I'm sorry, he said, simple, direct, the same as the apology in the stable, the one that had surprised her. For whatever it is that made this house feel that way, you don't deserve to feel like a tool. Nobody had said that to her. In 4 years, nobody had looked at the facts of her life in this house and called them what they were. She felt something crack very slightly behind her sternum. She put her hand on the fence post and looked at the wood grain and waited until the feeling passed. You're very direct for a land surveyor, she said. Is that a problem? No. She looked back at him. It's rare. He smiled at that, a real one, different from the practiced social expression she'd seen in the dining room. It changed his face considerably. I'll take rare. They walked the west fence line together, and Clara told him about the rot, and he took notes in a small leather journal, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with either of them: the price of timber, the summer drought's effect on the tobacco crop, whether the new road being built north of Charlottesville would change things for the valley. She did not think about the fact that he might be more than he appeared. She thought about the fact that he listened when she spoke, not the polite surface-level listening of people waiting for their turn to talk. The real kind. The kind that meant when she said something he actually considered it before he responded. She had not experienced that in 4 years, maybe longer. Margaret noticed, of course. Margaret noticed everything that occurred within the property lines of Ashbury Manor. She noticed on the 4th day when she looked out the morning room window and saw Clara walking back from the east pasture with the land surveyor. She said nothing immediately. She filed it away with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years collecting information and deploying it at the moment of maximum usefulness. On the 5th day, she called Clara into the parlor. "You've been spending time with the surveyor," she said. It was not a question. "I've been showing him the property." Clara kept her voice even. "I know where the fence repairs were. It saves him time." "It is not your place to spend your mornings trailing around after hired men." "He's not—" Clara stopped. "I've been helpful. To the work. You are helpful." Margaret's voice was smooth and even, the voice of a woman who understood exactly how sharp her words were and calibrated them accordingly. That is precisely what you are here to be. You are not here to form attachments to itinerant workers who will be gone by the end of the month. She set down her embroidery. "You are not young enough for that kind of foolishness, Clara, and you are certainly not positioned for it." Clara heard every word. She heard the ones underneath the ones actually spoken. "You are nobody. You have nothing. You should not reach." "Yes, Aunt Margaret," she said. She left the parlor. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at her hands, the rough, capable, useful hands, and she breathed in and out, and she told herself that Margaret was right, that she was being foolish, that a man who listened when she talked was not a man who meant anything by it, that attentiveness was not affection, that she had lived 4 years without making that mistake, and she would not start now. She went down to the kitchen, and she helped with the bread, and she did not go near the east pasture. Nathan came to find her. He appeared at the kitchen garden gate at midday, hat in hand, with the careful expression of a man who has thought about how to approach something. "You didn't come out this morning," he said. "I had other duties." "Ah." He looked at the hat in his hands. "Your aunt spoke to you." Clara said nothing. "I thought she might." He looked up. "Miss Whitfield, I want to be clear about something." "Mr. Gray." She kept her voice gentle. She was very practiced at gentle. "Please don't. Whatever you were going to say, it's kinder not to." "I haven't said it yet." "You don't need to." She set down the basket she was carrying. "You're here for a month. Then you'll be gone. And I'll still be here. That's not a complaint, it's just a fact. And I've spent 4 years being very careful about facts." He was quiet for a moment. "You think I'm going to say something that will make things harder for you when I leave. Aren't you?" He looked at her for a long time. In the summer heat, with the kitchen garden smell of rosemary and warm earth around them, with the sound of the house behind her and the wide open property in front of him. "I don't know," he said finally, and she could hear something genuine in it, something unplanned. "But I don't think I can promise not to say it." Clara picked up her basket. "Then be careful," she said quietly, "because I have very little left that I can afford to lose." She went back into the kitchen, and she did not let herself turn around, and she told herself she was glad she had said it. She had been so clear, so sensible. She had been, she thought, desperately, magnificently, completely foolish. Because Nathan Gray had not walked away from the garden gate. He had stood there hat in hand watching her go. And if she had turned around, which she hadn't, which she refused to have done, she might have seen something on his face that looked very much like a man in the middle of deciding something he had not meant to decide. She did not turn around, but she heard his footsteps on the garden path for a long time, after slow and deliberate moving back toward the east pasture, and she stood at the kitchen counter with her hands pressed flat against the wood and her eyes closed, and she breathed, and she waited for the feeling to pass. It didn't pass. He didn't leave at the end of the first week. Clara noticed on the 8th morning when she saw the black surveying bag hanging on the same post near the south paddock gate, and the same worn boots propped outside the groundskeeper's cottage where Nathan Gray had been permitted to sleep since his 3rd night on the property. She noticed the way you notice a thing you've been trying not to look for with a small involuntary relief that she immediately resented herself for feeling. He was supposed to be gone in a month. He had been here 8 days. She was already counting. That was the problem right there. That was the exact shape of the danger she had warned herself about. She went to the kitchen and helped with breakfast and did not look out the window toward the south paddock. He came to find her anyway. Not at the kitchen garden gate this time. He found her in the back hallway of the house where she was reorganizing the linen closet, a task Margaret had invented specifically because Margaret needed Clara to be occupied and visible and in a place where she could be observed being useful rather than being anywhere near the east pasture. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was low. He was holding his hat again. She had started to notice that he held his hat when he was being careful about something, when he was trying to say a thing the right way. "I finished the west survey this morning. I'll be working the north line for the next 2 weeks." "I see." She did not look up from the linens. "The north line runs along the edge of your aunt's kitchen garden." "I'm aware of where the north line runs. I thought I should tell you, so you weren't surprised." She looked up at that. He was watching her with that steady assessing gaze that she could not for the life of her read properly because it contained too many things at once, attention, and something careful, and something underneath the careful that she refused to name. "Mr. Gray," she said quietly. "Are you warning me or informing me?" "I reckon I'm doing both, ma'am." She held his gaze for a full 3 seconds. Then she took a folded sheet from the shelf and shook it out and began refolding it because she needed something to do with her hands. "I'll try to have my morning work done before midday." "That's not—" He stopped. He looked at the hat. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She set the sheet down. "But what you mean and what's sensible aren't always the same thing, are they?" He was quiet, and then he said so quietly she almost missed it. "No, Miss Whitfield, they're not." He put his hat back on and went back to the north line, and Clara refolded 6 sheets that did not need refolding, and told herself she was handling this well. She was not handling this well. It was Elizabeth Carter who made things complicated in a way that had nothing to do with Nathan Gray. She arrived at Ashbury Manor on a Tuesday, riding with 2 of her friends, and all the easy confidence of a girl who has never had reason to doubt her welcome anywhere. She swept into the house, kissed Margaret's cheeks, called Clara by her first name, in the airy way people did when they wanted to be friendly without quite treating you as an equal, and immediately began talking about Nathaniel Whitmore. "He's coming back to the valley next week," Elizabeth said, arranging herself on the parlor settee like a woman posing for a portrait she expected to be hanging somewhere important one day. "My father had a letter. He's been in Richmond on business." She paused, tilting her head in a way that was calculated to look like she hadn't thought about this next part very much. He asked about Ashbury Manor specifically. Margaret set down her teacup with the careful precision of a woman whose hands were entirely steady and whose mind was moving very fast. "Did he?" "He did." Elizabeth's smile was the smile of a girl holding a card she intended to play. "Papa thinks he may be considering a longer stay in the valley this summer, getting to know the families better." Clara was sitting near the window with her, mending the position she always occupied in these conversations, near enough to be available, far enough to be forgotten. She watched her aunt's face do the complex internal calculation of a woman who had one very nice piece of property, one indebted husband, and one golden-haired neighbor who represented the most elegant solution to a number of problems. "How lovely," Margaret said. "We must have him for dinner again. Several dinners." "I thought you might say that." Elizabeth looked sideways at Clara with an expression that was pleasant on the surface and entirely something else underneath. Clara, you must have made quite an impression the last time. I heard he spent part of the evening in the stable." The room went very still. Clara kept her eyes on her mending. Her needle went in and came out with absolute precision. "I was checking on one of the mares," she said. "He happened to be in there. We exchanged perhaps 3 sentences." Of course. Elizabeth's tone was warm, with the practiced warmth of a girl who had been raised to seem kind while being something else entirely. "I only meant that he seemed interested in the household, in everyone." She meant, "I know something happened. I am telling you that I know. I am telling you to remember what you are." Margaret heard it too. Clara could see it in the minute tightening around her aunt's mouth, the way her fingers paused on her embroidery. "Nathaniel Whitmore," Margaret said with an air of settling something, "is a man who is looking for a wife. He needs someone of corresponding position and temperament, someone who understands what that kind of life requires." "Absolutely," Elizabeth agreed. Neither of them looked at Clara. They didn't need to. Nathan was at the north fence line the next morning, just as he'd said he would be. Clara came out to the kitchen garden at her usual time and found him 10 feet from the gate, crouched over a post with his measuring line entirely absorbed in the work. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Morning, Miss Whitfield." "Good morning." She began checking the bean plants with far more attention than bean plants required. "How's the north line?" "Mostly sound. There's one section near the creek bend where the posts have shifted. Old damage from a flood, looks like." He stood and made a note in the journal. "Should have been fixed years ago. My uncle kept meaning to get to it. The thing about fence posts is they don't get better if you wait." "No," she said. "They don't." He was looking at her. She could feel it even with her back half turned. "Something happened," he said. It was not a question. She had noticed that about him. He didn't ask things he already knew. He stated them and left space for her to decide whether to fill it. She stood up from the beans and looked at him directly. "Elizabeth Carter is planning to marry Nathaniel Whitmore. Her family is, at any rate. And my aunt is planning to help her." She paused. "I'm telling you because it affects the household schedule. There will be more events, more guests. You should know to stay clear of the main house on those evenings." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "And you?" he said. "How does it affect you?" "It doesn't." She heard how flat that sounded and moderated it slightly. "It changes nothing for me. Doesn't it?" "Mr. Gray," she kept her voice even, "I am a woman with no money, no family standing, and no claim on anyone in this county. The social ambitions of my aunt and the Carter family have nothing to do with me. They never have. They have everything to do with you," he said. "You just don't let yourself say so." That landed harder than she expected. She pressed her lips together and looked back at the bean plants. "I say what's useful to say. That's a sad way to live. It's a safe way to live." She heard something sharpen in her own voice that she hadn't meant to let through. "And I've found safe matters more than people realize until the moment it's gone." He was very still. He let the silence sit for a full moment, the real kind of silence, not the waiting kind. And then he said, "Who taught you that?" 4 years in this house," she said, "and some things before." He nodded slowly. He did not push past it. He went back to his measuring line and his fence post, and Clara went back to the beans, and neither of them spoke for several minutes. But he didn't leave. That was the thing. He stayed at the north fence line all morning, working steadily and quietly, and Clara worked in the kitchen garden, and the space between them was the most comfortable 10 feet she had occupied in longer than she could remember. That was the thing she would remember later, when she tried to understand how it had happened. Not the words, the 10 feet. The first time in 4 years she'd felt something close to not being alone. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Clara was the one who sorted the household correspondence, another task delegated to her on the grounds that she had good handwriting and could be trusted to be discreet. She was carrying the stack from the postwriter to her aunt's morning room when she felt the weight of the envelope on top and registered the seal pressed into the dark wax. She recognized it. She had seen it once briefly at the dinner party, the monogram on a silver ring. She had filed it away without knowing why. W. In a clean-pressed serif. She delivered the letter with the rest of the correspondence and said nothing. An hour later, Margaret called her into the morning room with the focused energy of a woman who has received news she intends to act on immediately. "Nathaniel Whitmore is hosting a gathering at his estate next Saturday," she said, holding the letter open. "A garden party. The whole valley is invited." She looked at Clara over the top of the page. "We will be attending." "Of course," Clara said. "Elizabeth Carter will be there. The Pembertons. The Aldridges." Margaret set the letter down. "I want the household in order before we leave. I want you to manage the kitchen and the linens and make sure everything is prepared for our return." Clara absorbed this. "You want me to stay here while you attend?" "You'll be more useful here." There it was. The word again. The word like a door closing. She looked at her aunt, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was so tired. She was so tired of being useful. She was so tired of being the thing that made rooms run, and events succeed, and other people's lives easier, and receiving in return not even the dignity of being visible. "Yes, Aunt Margaret," she said. She left the room, and she went to find Nathan Gray at the north fence line, because she needed to say it out loud to someone who was going to actually hear her. He was there. He looked up when he heard her coming, took one look at her face, and set down his measuring line. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She told him about the letter and the garden party and being left behind again. She told him without theatrics, without tears, in the flat, practical voice she'd learned to use for things that hurt the voice that said, "This is just information. This is just a fact. I am not making a scene about a fact." She told him, and she watched him listen, and she waited for the thing people usually said, which was some version of, "I'm sure she means well," or "Your time will come," or the worst one at least. "You have a roof over your head." He didn't say any of those things. He said, "That's not right." 2 words. That's not right. She felt them hit somewhere behind her collarbone with the force of something she had been waiting 4 years to hear. Not "it will get better" or "she doesn't mean it." Just a quiet level acknowledgement that a wrong thing was wrong. "No," she said. "It's not." "What would you do?" he asked. "If you could. If none of the if things were different. What would you do with yourself, Clara?" He used her name. He'd never used her first name before. She should have noted it and pulled back from it, but she was too far into the honesty of the conversation to stop now. "I'd have my own house," she said. "Not a grand one. I don't need grand, but mine. I'd have a garden. I'd read what I wanted to read. I'd talk to people who wanted to talk to me, not people who needed something from me." She paused. "I'd have a horse." Prudence. Prudence would be my first choice, yes. Something crossed his face, an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something that mixed amusement with something more serious, more intent. "Those are very reasonable things to want." "Most things I want are reasonable." She looked at the fence line. "That doesn't seem to matter much." "It should." "Mr. Gray." She looked back at him. "You are either a very kind man or a very dangerous one. I haven't decided which." He looked at her steadily. "Can't it be both?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked away first, which she almost never did, because it felt like losing something, which meant she had already started treating this like a contest, like something to win or lose, which was a very bad sign indeed. "I need to go help with the supper," she said. "I know." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for the "that's not right" for the 2 words that had mattered more than 100 polished compliments would have. "I didn't do anything," he said. "Yes," she said quietly. "You did." The night before the Whitmore garden party, something happened that Clara would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward. She had gone down to the kitchen late to check that the bread was covered, and the fire properly banked, one of the dozen small tasks she did out of habit, out of the ingrained sense that if she didn't check, something would go wrong, and it would somehow be her fault. She was coming back through the dark hallway when she heard voices in her Uncle Edmund's study. She stopped. She knew she should keep walking. She knew the rule of this house, which was that Clara did not put herself in the path of information that wasn't directed at her. She had survived 4 years by respecting that rule. She stood in the hallway, and she listened anyway. Her Uncle Edmund's voice low and strained. "The sum is considerable, Margaret. I cannot pretend otherwise." "I am not asking you to pretend." Margaret's voice clipped and precise. "I am asking you to be patient. The Whitmore connection will change everything. The Whitmore connection requires him to choose Elizabeth. We cannot control what a man chooses. We can manage circumstances." A pause. "The garden party is an opportunity. Elizabeth will be at her best. I will speak to Thomas Carter privately about timing. Whitmore is not a foolish man. He understands legacy and property as well as anyone. A strategic alliance. He is not a political appointment, Margaret. He is a man. A man with 12,000 acres and no heir." Her aunt's voice was patient and merciless. "Which makes him a very particular kind of opportunity, one we cannot afford to waste." Silence. Then Edmund, heavier and quieter. "And if he doesn't choose her?" A longer pause. "Then we consider other options. But we are not there yet." Clara backed away from the door, one careful step at a time, until she was far enough down the hall that she could move without being heard. She went upstairs. She sat on her bed. She thought about 12,000 acres. She thought about the word opportunity used to describe a human being. She thought about Elizabeth Carter, who was 18 and golden, and entirely unaware that she was being managed like a field crop. She thought about what it meant that her aunt's solution to considerable sum was to use a girl as a transaction. She thought unexpectedly about Nathan Gray, about the way he had said, "That's not right," like it was the simplest, most obvious truth in the world. She lay down on her narrow bed in her small back room, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about how strange it was that the only person in this house who had looked at her situation and called it what it was, unfair. Unnecessary, a wrong thing, was a land surveyor from somewhere unspecified who held his hat when he was being careful and produced apples for horses from his coat pocket, and listened to her like she was actually worth listening to. She thought, "He is going to leave. He said a month. It has been nearly 2 weeks. I have 2 weeks left, and then he will be gone, and I will be exactly where I was before, except that I will know what it felt like to be seen, which is possibly worse than never knowing at all." She thought, "This is how people get hurt. This exact thing. This." She closed her eyes. She slept badly. The morning of the garden party, the Hartley household rose early and with purpose. Margaret moved through the house like a general before battle, issuing instructions, examining details, correcting, and adjusting and critiquing with the focused energy of a woman who understood that appearances were the only currency that truly mattered. She looked at Clara exactly once and said, "Don't let the milk sour." And then she was gone, and the house was quiet, and Clara was alone. She went to the kitchen garden. She did not go there because she expected Nathan to be there. She went because she always went there, because the garden was one of the few places on this property where she could breathe without accounting for it to anyone. He was there. He was sitting on the low stone wall at the north end of the garden with his journal open across his knees and his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked up when she came through the gate with an expression that said he had been expecting her. "They've gone," she said. "I know. I heard the carriages." He closed the journal. "How are you?" "I'm fine." "Clara?" His voice was quiet and direct. "How are you?" She sat on the wall several feet from him, which was close enough to be a choice, and far enough to maintain the appearance of sense. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm so tired of being angry that the anger has started to feel like weather, like something that just lives here." He nodded. He didn't try to fix it. "I heard them last night," she said. "My aunt and my uncle. They're in debt. I don't know how much, but Edmund sounded frightened, and Edmund doesn't frighten easily." She paused. "They're hoping Nathaniel Whitmore will marry Elizabeth Carter, and that it will help them somehow. I don't know the specifics." Nathan was very still. "I know it's none of my business," she said. "I'm not telling you because I expect you to do anything. I'm telling you because—" She stopped. "Because I don't have anyone else to tell." "That's enough reason," he said quietly. "Is it?" She looked at the garden. "I used to think I was good at being alone. I was wrong. I was just good at pretending I was fine with it." He was quiet for a moment. The summer air moved through the kitchen garden, warm and green-smelling. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "If someone had deceived you, if someone you'd begun to trust had not told you the complete truth about who they were, could you forgive them? If the feeling was real, even if the circumstances weren't—" She frowned slightly. It was an odd question. It felt like it was about something, but she couldn't place what. "That depends on why they didn't tell the truth." "Fear," he said. "Fear that the truth would change things, that the person would stop seeing them and start seeing something else." She thought about it seriously, the way he had asked it seriously. "I think I could," she said finally. "If the fear made sense. If they told me eventually." She paused. "What I couldn't forgive is someone who used the deception to take something from me, who lied to profit from it." She looked at him. "Why do you ask?" He looked down at the journal in his hands. "No reason," he said. "Just something I've been thinking about." There was something in his voice that snagged on something in her chest, a note she couldn't identify, too low and too careful, like a word placed deliberately in a sentence to be found later. She almost pressed him on it. She almost said, "That's not no reason, that's a reason you don't want to name." But the moment passed, and he looked up and smiled at her. The real one, the one that changed his face, and she let it go. She would think about that question for a long time after. If someone had deceived you, if the feeling was real. They spent the morning talking. Not about anything momentous, about books she'd read and hadn't been able to discuss with anyone, because nobody in this house read for pleasure, about the mechanics of property surveys, about what she would plant in the garden if it were hers to choose. He told her something about his family, not much kept it spare, but enough. A father who had been hard and driven and exacting. A childhood spent trying to earn approval by performance. An adulthood spent trying to figure out what he actually valued when the performance was over. "You don't seem like a man who's still performing," she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I'm not sure that's true," he said. "But I'm working on it." He reached into his coat pocket. She had started watching for this. The reach that meant something was coming, and produced not an apple this time, but a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it. It was a drawing done in the same pencil as his survey notes. A rough sketch of the kitchen garden from above. The way a surveyor saw things, with the bean rows, and the rosemary, and the gate marked. But in the far corner, where the wall met the shade of the oak tree, he had drawn a small figure, sitting with a book. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "That's how I see it," he said simply. "Every time I look at the north line." She folded the paper very carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She looked at the oak tree in the corner of the garden, and she breathed in and out, and she thought, "I am in so much trouble." "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "When you're done with the survey." She made herself look at him. "Where do you go?" He held her gaze. He was doing it again, the careful placement, the deliberate wait in the silence before he spoke. "That," he said slowly, "is something I've been thinking about more than I expected." She should have pushed. She should have said that's not an answer and held the line until she got one. She should have protected herself the way she had been protecting herself for years. Instead, she stood up and brushed off her apron and said, "I need to start supper." And she walked back into the house with the folded drawing against her hip, and her heart doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. They came back from the garden party at dusk. Her aunt flushed with a success. Clara could read from 20 paces. Edmund quieter. Elizabeth Carter, riding alongside in the second carriage, with an expression that suggested the day had gone exactly as hoped. Margaret swept through the front door and handed her gloves and hat to Clara, without slowing down. "Nathaniel Whitmore is an extraordinary man," she said. like she was closing an argument nobody had started. And Elizabeth Carter is very nearly up to the task of being worthy of him. Yes, Aunt Margaret. He spoke to her quite a bit during the afternoon. Thomas Carter was very encouraged. She paused on the stairs and looked down at Clara with the assessing eye she used when calculating value. Did you keep the milk from souring? Yes. Good. She continued up the stairs. Make sure there's something warm for supper. Edmund has a headache. Clara stood in the hall and listened to the house settle back around her, and thought about Nathaniel Whitmore speaking quite a bit to Elizabeth Carter at a garden party she had not been permitted to attend. She thought about her aunt's voice, saying very nearly up to the task of being worthy of him, as though being worthy of a man's attention was the axis around which a woman's life was supposed to turn. She went to the kitchen. She made supper. She put food on the table and cleared it away, and washed the dishes and banked the fire for the night. She went upstairs. She took the folded sketch from her apron pocket and sat with it for a long time. The little figure by the oak tree reading. She refolded it. She put it in the Bible on her nightstand between two pages she knew by heart. She told herself to be sensible. She was a grown woman with a clear picture of her circumstances and no useful illusions. She knew what Nathan Gray was: a man passing through a month's work, the kind of person who appeared in your life at the exact moment most calculated to undo your defenses, and then disappeared back to wherever they came from. She knew this. She blew out the lamp. She blew. In the dark, she pressed her hand flat over the Bible on the nightstand, over the sketch folded inside it, and she stayed like that for a long time. Outside, somewhere across the property, she heard a horse moving slowly in the paddock. She heard footsteps on the gravel path, unhurried, deliberate moving in the direction of the groundskeeper's cottage. She listened until they stopped, and then she closed her eyes, and the feeling in her chest that had no safe name expanded very quietly in the dark, and she thought, 2 weeks. I have 2 more weeks. She did not sleep for a long time. The 2 weeks did not feel like 2 weeks. They felt like something else entirely, like the last hour before a storm, when the air changes and everything becomes very clear and very still, and you are aware with a sharpness you don't usually have of exactly what you are about to lose. Nathan stayed at the north fence line. Clara stayed in the kitchen garden. And every morning they talked, and every evening she went back inside, and the days moved with a speed that seemed deliberately cruel. She started noticing things she had not allowed herself to notice before. The way he tilted his head slightly when she said something that surprised him. The fact that he always positioned himself so that the sun was behind her rather than in her eyes, which was such a small thing and such a considered thing that it made her feel looked after in a way she hadn't been in so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. The way his voice changed when he was being careful about something, dropped just slightly, became more precise, like a man choosing his footing on uncertain ground. She noticed all of it. She filed none of it away. She just let herself look the way she had not let herself look at anything she couldn't afford to want. She knew she was making a mistake. She made it anyway. On the 3rd morning of the final week, Margaret sent word through the kitchen girl that Clara was needed in the house all morning to prepare for a luncheon. Clara came out to the garden gate at her usual time, only to leave a note she'd written on a torn piece of paper, just 3 words. Luncheon. Inside. Sorry. She tucked it under the stone beside the gate where he would see it. When she came out again at midday, the note was gone. In its place was a small stem of rosemary from the garden, which meant he'd leaned over the gate to take the note and set the rosemary down in the same motion, and beneath it, in his surveyor's handwriting, 1 word, tomorrow. She stood at the gate and held the rosemary sprig in both hands and breathed in and out and told herself very firmly that this was the behavior of a man being kind to a lonely woman and nothing more. She told herself that 3 times on the way back to the house. She didn't believe it once. The luncheon brought Thomas Carter, and it brought Elizabeth, and it brought the kind of conversation that made Clara feel as though she were watching a chess game through glass, able to see every move being made, unable to do anything about any of them. Margaret had placed the Carter family at the center of the table and positioned herself across from Thomas Carter, with the focused grace of a woman conducting a negotiation while appearing to conduct a social occasion. Edmund sat at the end and said little and drank more than he usually did at midday. Elizabeth talked about the garden party, about the grounds of Whitmore Plantation, the size of the house, the quality of the horses, with the bright, careful enthusiasm of a girl rehearsing a future out loud. "He danced with me twice," Elizabeth said. And the way she said it, the weight she put on twice, as though frequency were a legal document, made Clara's chest hurt, in a way she could not entirely account for. Margaret smiled. "He's a discerning man. He asked about my interests." Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap, with the composure of someone performing composure. "I told him I was fond of music and had some skill with watercolors." Thomas Carter cleared his throat. He seemed interested. He said in the voice of a man who wanted to believe something and was not entirely sure he did. "He is considering his options," Margaret said smoothly. "That is entirely appropriate for a man of his standing. What matters is that the right option be clearly presented." Clara refilled the water pitcher. Nobody looked at her. She went back to her station near the sideboard, and she thought about Nathan Gray in the kitchen garden asking her if someone had deceived you, could you forgive them? She turned the question over again, the way she had been turning it over every night since he'd asked it. It had the texture of something unfinished, something pointed at a particular destination. She looked at Thomas Carter's face, the strained, hopeful face of a man with a daughter to settle and a concern he wasn't naming, and she thought, something is not right about this picture, something I don't have enough of to see clearly yet. She set down the pitcher and she kept the thought. Nathan finished the north fence line on Thursday. He told her at the gate on Thursday morning, and she heard the shape of it before the words landed fully, the slight difference in how he stood, the way he held the journal at his side, rather than open in his hands. Done with the north line meant 2 days left, maybe 3, maybe less. I have to report back by end of next week," he said. He wasn't looking at her directly. He was looking at the rosemary bed, which was his, till she'd learned the place he looked when he was being careful about something that mattered. "I know," she said. "I don't want to." The directness of it caught her off guard. She held very still. "Mr. Gray." "Nathan." He looked at her then. "You call me Nathan when you're not being careful." She did. She hadn't realized she'd started doing it. "Nathan," she said. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying—" He stopped. He started again. "I'm saying that whatever this has been these 2 weeks, it has been the most real thing I've experienced in long enough that I can't put a number to it. And I don't know how to leave here like it was nothing." Her heart was doing something she had specifically asked it not to do. "You don't have a choice about leaving. I might have a choice about what happens after." She looked at him for a long moment. The summer morning was already warm and bright, and the kitchen garden smelled of rosemary and warm earth. And she thought, this is the moment. This is where you are careful. "Nathan, I don't know who you go back to. I don't know your situation. I only know what you've told me, which is very little, which I noticed, and which I accepted because—" She stopped. Because what you did tell me felt true," she said quietly. "And I was choosing to take what was true over needing all of it at once." Something moved across his face, something that looked for just a moment like pain. "Clara, don't." She said it gently. "Don't tell me something you can't follow through on. I have had 4 years of people meaning well in the moment, and then the moment ending." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to say something that holds." He held her gaze, his jaw tightened. He looked like a man in the middle of a decision he had not finished making. "Give me 1 more day," he said. "For what?" "To say it right." She nodded. One short, careful nod. "Tomorrow," she said. His word from the note returned to him. He pressed his lips together and dipped his head, and she turned and went inside before she could say anything. She would not be able to take back. She was in the library that afternoon when she heard Margaret in the hallway speaking to someone in a voice she recognized lower than usual, precise in the way Margaret was precise when she was managing a thing she did not want managed badly. "It is a generous offer," her aunt was saying. "Edmund will be grateful." A man's voice, not Edmund. Someone she didn't recognize. "Mr. Whitmore asks only that the arrangement remain private until the matter is settled. He prefers to conduct these things quietly." "Of course." A pause. "The Carters are expecting. Mr. Whitmore has his own conclusions about the Carters." The voice was dry. "He is a careful man. He does not commit where he has not decided." "I see." Margaret again recalibrating. "And the purpose of the private arrangement? He is making inquiries, discreet ones, into the households of the valley." A pause. "He values information about character, about how people behave when they don't think anyone important is watching." Silence. "You will receive confirmation by Friday," the man's voice said. Clara stood in the library with her hand on the shelf and her blood running very cold. Discreet inquiries. How people behave when they don't think anyone important is watching. She thought about Nathan Gray. She thought about his hat and his leather journal and his apple for prudence and his careful questions and the sketch of the kitchen garden with the small figure reading by the oak tree. She thought about 2 weeks of the most real conversation she had experienced in years, in which he had asked her carefully calibrated questions about forgiveness and deception and what she valued and what she dreamed about. She thought, no. She thought, no, that is not what this is. That is not what he is. He is not a spy. He is not an arrangement. He is a man you've known for 2 weeks, said the cold, clear voice that had kept her safe for years. A man who told you very little about himself. A man who appeared at your aunt's property with a letter of introduction you never read from a consortium he didn't name. She set her hand flat against the bookshelf and breathed. She could be wrong. She needed to be wrong. She walked out of the library and through the hallway and into the kitchen yard and across to the south paddock with the steady, unhurried walk of a woman who is keeping herself together by the specific act of moving. He was at the groundskeeper's cottage. She knocked. He opened the door and took one look at her and said, "What happened?" "Who are you?" she said. The pause was a fraction of a second too long. A fraction. She would not have caught it 2 weeks ago. She caught it now because she had been watching him long enough to know his rhythms, and that fraction was the sound of a man's footing shifting. "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean..." She kept her voice level. She needed it level. "I heard something in the hallway about Nathaniel Whitmore sending someone to make inquiries, discreet ones, about the households of the valley, about how people behave when nobody important is watching." She looked at him. "And I am standing here telling myself I am wrong about you." He said nothing. "Tell me I'm wrong," she said. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. She counted. She knew because her heart was beating in a particular hard, heavy way that made the seconds easy to count. "Come inside," he said quietly. "I don't want to come inside. I want you to tell me I'm wrong." "Clara." "My name," she said, and something in her voice shifted, not loud, but absolutely final, "is Miss Whitfield, until I know who I am talking to." He closed his eyes for 1 moment. When he opened them, they held something she had not seen in them before. Not the careful attention, not the warmth. Something older and more tired. "You're not wrong," he said. She heard that sentence and she felt the kitchen garden and the rosemary and the sketch and the "that's not right." And 2 weeks of the most real thing she'd felt in years collapse inward like a house whose frame had been quietly removed. She did not make a sound. She was very practiced at not making sounds. "My name is Nathaniel," he said. "Nathaniel Whitmore." The world reorganized itself around those 3 words in a way that was almost physically disorienting. She looked at the man in the doorway, the plain coat, the working boots, the hat she had watched him hold when he was being careful, and she felt the pieces rearrange and lock into a new configuration that made terrible, humiliating sense. "The richest man in the valley," she said. Yes. Who came here in disguise to observe how people behaved? Yes. A pause. Not you specifically. The survey was real. My reasons for doing it this way were what? She heard her voice come out very quiet and very controlled, which was the most dangerous version of her voice, the one that meant she was holding something enormous very still. Were they to conduct an experiment on ordinary people to see if anyone would treat you like a human being? Were they to ask carefully selected questions about forgiveness and deception to measure whether someone was worth what? Worth adding to your picture of the valley? Worth trusting? No. He took a step toward her. Clara? Miss Whitfield. He stopped. He stood in the cottage doorway with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with an expression she could not look at, so she looked at the ground between them instead. I came here, he said, because I was tired. I have been the women who pursue me, pursue the name and the land and the position. Every conversation is a strategy. Every smile is an investment. I have not had a real conversation in years. His voice was low and strained, and she could hear something true in it, which was the worst part, because she did not want to hear true things right now. I wanted to know what it felt like, to just be a person. And then I met you and I don't. Her voice cracked slightly on the word. She pressed her lips together. Don't tell me that part yet. I am not ready to hear that part yet. He went quiet. You asked me, she said. 3 days ago. You asked if I could forgive someone who had deceived me if the feeling was real. She looked up at him. You were asking for yourself. Yes. You were measuring my answer. No. He said it with a force that surprised her. I was terrified of my answer. There is a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. The man she had called Nathan Gray. The man who had produced apples for horses and held his hat when he was careful and drawn a small figure in the corner of a kitchen garden sketch. The man who had said, "That's not right," like it was the simplest truth in the world. The wealthiest landowner in the Shenandoah Valley. I need to think, she said. I know. I need to think without you standing in front of me. Of course. He did not move for a moment. Clara, Miss Whitfield, whatever I am to you right now, everything I said to you was true. Every word of it. The name was wrong. Nothing else was. She turned and walked back across the yard. She did not run. She would not run. She walked with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she went up the back stairs and into her room, and she closed the door, and she stood in the middle of the floor, and she thought, I knew. Somewhere I knew. The questions too well placed, the listening too focused, the man too careful about things that a land surveyor had no reason to be careful about. She had chosen not to know, because she had been so hungry for someone to see her that she had not looked carefully at what the seeing cost. She did not go to the kitchen garden the next morning. She told herself she was giving herself time to think, which was true. She was also punishing him in the only way available to her, which was her absence, and she was aware this was also true, and she was not sorry for it. Margaret noticed. Of course Margaret noticed. She found Clara in the linen room at midday, with the sharp assessing gaze of a woman who collects information the way other people collect silver. The surveyor, she said. Has he finished with the North Line? I believe so, Clara said. He'll be leaving soon then. I expect. Margaret studied her for a moment, with the particular attention of a woman reading a page of text someone has tried to obscure. You have been spending time with him, she said, not an accusation, an observation being carefully deployed. More time than was suitable. Clara looked at her aunt. He was a good conversationalist. He was a hired man. Margaret's voice was gentle in the way that held no gentleness. Clara, I say this for your benefit. A woman in your position cannot afford the kind of romantic sentiment that clouds judgment. You have no standing from which to recover if you make a misstep. You understand that? Yes, Clara said. "I understand my position very well, Aunt Margaret. I have understood it for 4 years." Margaret heard something in it she always heard the underneath, and she looked at Clara with an expression that was briefly unexpectedly human. Not warm, but honest. "You are not without value," she said. "You are simply unclaimed. And unclaimed women in this world must be extraordinarily careful." Clara looked at her. She thought about 12,000 acres. She thought about opportunity and strategic alliance, and Elizabeth Carter being managed like a crop. "Is Elizabeth Carter claimed?" she said. Margaret blinked. "Elizabeth is 18 years old, being positioned for a marriage she didn't choose to a man twice her age to solve a financial problem that isn't her fault." Clara kept her voice even. "Is that being claimed, or is that being used?" The silence in the linen room was absolute. Margaret said very quietly, "That is enough." "Yes," Clara said, "it is." She left the linen room, and she went downstairs, and she put on her hat, and she walked out to the south paddock, and she knocked on the groundskeeper's cottage door. He opened it immediately. He had not been sleeping. She could see it in his face, the sharpness of a man who had been awake a long time thinking. "You were going to tell me," she said. "You told me tomorrow. Yesterday was tomorrow, and you were going to tell me." "Yes." "Would you have—" He held her gaze. "Yes. I have been trying to find the right way since the first week. Every day I stayed longer than I was supposed to." A pause. "I was supposed to be here 5 days. The survey was genuine, but it didn't require 2 weeks. I kept extending it." She absorbed this. "Because of me. Because of you." She stood in the doorway of the cottage and looked at the man who was Nathaniel Whitmore and thought about all the ways this could go. She thought about Elizabeth Carter's father in her aunt's parlor, talking about how encouraged he was. She thought about her aunt's debt and Edmund's frightened voice. She thought about the position she was in, no money, no standing, no name, living in a house that had never claimed her. And she thought about a small figure in the corner of a sketch reading under an oak tree. "I am angry," she said. "I want you to know that clearly. What you did was wrong, not the survey. The 2 weeks of letting me believe you were something other than what you are. That was wrong." "Yes," he said. "It was. And I am not. I am not in a position to be graceful about it right now. I am not going to tell you it's fine because it isn't fine. I know. But—" She stopped. He waited. "But I said something to you in that garden," she said slowly. "About whether I could forgive deception if the reason made sense. And I meant what I said. And I am trying to hold on to what I meant when I said it." She looked at him. "I need more time." "I'll stay," he said immediately. "As long as you need. I'll find a reason." "You own 12,000 acres?" she said with a slightly unsteady edge that was the closest she'd come to something that wasn't grief or anger. "I imagine you can find a reason." Something moved across his face, relief, and something more fragile than relief. "I imagine I can." She nodded once. She turned to go. "Clara." His voice stopped her. She didn't turn. "I saw you," he said. "From the first night. Before any of this, I saw you, and I couldn't stop looking. And that is the most true thing I've ever said." She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, once brief, like sealing something. She walked back across the yard. She was wrong to think the worst was behind her. The letter arrived the next morning, not to Margaret, not to Edmund, to her. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, neat, masculine, deliberate. Inside 2 lines. "Miss Whitfield, I owe you a full accounting of my intentions. Would you do me the honor of meeting me at the Old Creek Bridge at 4 o'clock this afternoon? N.W." She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She spent the morning doing her work with the precise automatic efficiency she used when her mind was elsewhere. She made bread. She mended a torn curtain. She sat with her aunt at midday and answered questions in single sentences and did not volunteer information. She watched the clock in the kitchen with a patience she did not feel. She went to the creek bridge at 4 o'clock. He was already there. He had come on horseback, not the workman's horse he'd been using during the survey, but a different animal finer, the kind of horse that cost more than most families in the valley earned in a year. Clara noted this without commenting on it. He dismounted when he saw her. He held his hat. "You came," he said. "You asked," she said. "And I have decided that I would rather have this conversation than not have it." He nodded. He began to speak, and for the next several minutes she let him. He told her things he had not told her in 2 weeks of daily conversation. The full truth of how it had started the friend who had suggested the scheme. The specific exhaustion of 15 years of being courted for his land and his name. He told her about the 2 women before, who had professed love and meant position. He told her what it had done to his ability to trust what he heard. He told her finally why he had stayed so far past the 5 days he'd planned. "Because you argued with me," he said, "about Elizabeth Carter, about unkind and untrue not being the same thing. Do you remember that?" "I remember. Nobody argues with me," he said. "Not like that. Not because they actually disagree, because they see it differently, and they think I ought to know." He looked at her. "I have been surrounded for years by people who manage me. You are the first person who just talked to me." She held his gaze for a long time. "And now you know I'll tell you the truth," she said. "So here is some truth. What you did cost me something. Not because you're not who I thought you were. I am learning who you are, and there is much of it She stopped. She took a breath. "What it cost me is this. I was just beginning to believe that someone had seen me, the real me, and now I have to untangle how much of what felt like being seen was actually being studied." He flinched. She watched it happen, and she did not soften it because it was true, and he had asked for truth. "I understand," he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I don't know if what I feel about you is real, or if it is what I feel about being noticed for the first time in 4 years. I don't know the difference yet, and I think," she steadied herself, "I think that until I know I cannot give you an answer about anything." "Then I'll wait," he said. "I told you I would." "You should know," she said carefully, "that my aunt has a debt, and that there are people in this valley who see you as a solution to that debt, and that I will not be a strategy. Whatever else I am, I will not be used as a piece in someone else's arrangement." He looked at her with an expression she was only beginning to be able to read the real one under the careful one. "Clara, you are the only person in this valley I have spoken to without a strategy. You are the opposite of an arrangement." She believed him. That was the thing. Despite everything, despite the 2 weeks of half-truth and the name she hadn't known, and the letter of introduction from a consortium that didn't exist, she believed him. She didn't tell him that. She wasn't ready to give him that yet. 4 o'clock tomorrow, she said instead. "Same place. Bring the journal. I want to see the actual survey notes." He blinked. "The survey notes. If you surveyed this property, I want to see what you actually found. I know this land better than anyone, and I want to see if your eye is as good as I think it is." She paused. "And I want to know something real. Something I can verify. Something that doesn't require me to take it on faith." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him settled a slight easing of the careful set of his shoulders, like a man who has been holding his breath and been told he is permitted to stop. "Yes," he said. "I'll bring the notes." She turned to leave. "Miss Whitfield." His voice caught her. She turned. He was standing with his hat in his hands, and the look on his face of a man who has said many things carefully and is now about to say one thing without care at all. "For what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth very much right now, you were right. About prudence. She didn't trust the apple. She trusted the man who brought it." Clara stood very still. "I think," he said quietly, "that you are doing the same thing. And I think that is the most sensible thing I have ever watched anyone do." She turned back around and walked away without answering, because there was nothing safe to say to that, and she was done pretending she was safe. Behind her, she heard him let out a long, slow breath. She walked back up the road with the late afternoon light on the fields and the sound of the creek behind her and her hands pressed against her sides to keep them steady. And she thought about horses and apples and trust. And she thought about tomorrow at 4 o'clock. And she thought about what it meant that she was already counting the hours. She was in so much trouble. She had known it for 2 weeks. She was only now beginning to decide that trouble might be worth it. He brought the journal. She had half expected him not to half expected some version of a powerful man deciding that the terms of a woman with no standing were not terms he was required to honor. But he was at the creek bridge at 4 o'clock with the leather journal under his arm and his hat in his hand. And when she came down the road and saw him standing there, something in her chest did a thing she chose not to examine too closely. She took the journal. She sat on the flat stone at the edge of the bridge, and she read every page of the survey notes from the beginning, while he stood a few feet away and said nothing. He was good. That was the first thing she noticed, and it annoyed her slightly, because she had been prepared to find errors, small professional failures, that would give her something to hold on to. Some evidence that the careful attention he paid to everything was selective, performed. But his notes were precise and thorough, and reflected a genuine understanding of the land. He had noted the flood damage at the creek bend exactly as she knew it. He had recorded the rot on the west fence line in terms that matched what she had seen with her own eyes. He had written in the margin beside his notation about the north pasture soil, a single observation unusually well tended for a household that does not appear to employ a dedicated groundskeeper. Someone is paying attention. She sat with that sentence for a moment. You wrote this in the first week, she said. Day 4, he said. You were all ready. She stopped. Yes, he said quietly. I was all ready. She closed the journal. She looked at the creek moving below them. These are good notes, she said. Thank you. I'm not complimenting you. I'm establishing that the work was real, that you actually looked at this property. I actually looked, he said, at everything. She handed the journal back and stood and looked at him directly, the way she'd been practicing in her own head since 4 o'clock yesterday. I have decided something, she said. He waited. I have decided that I believe you, that the feeling was real, that you meant what you said. She held up one hand before he could speak. I have also decided that believing you and knowing what to do about it are two entirely different things, and I am not going to collapse the distance between them just because I want to. He nodded slowly. That's fair. It's more than fair. It's the only sensible position available to me. She crossed her arms not defensively, more like bracing. You are Nathaniel Whitmore. I am a woman who lives in her aunt's house on her aunt's sufferance and owns nothing but a Bible and a gray dress. The space between those two facts is not romantic. It is a problem. Problems can be solved. Don't be glib. I'm not being glib. Something sharpened in his voice. Not offense, but a kind of focused seriousness she hadn't heard from him before the voice underneath the careful one. I am telling you that I am a man with considerable resources and one very clear priority, and the problem you are describing is not insurmountable, not even close. She looked at him for a long moment. You are very sure of yourself. I am very sure of this, he said. That is different. She wanted to argue with that. She found she couldn't, which frustrated her, so she looked at the creek instead. My aunt's debt, she said. Do you know the amount? A pause. I have a general sense of it. She turned back to him sharply. How? Because I've been making inquiries for 2 months about the households of the valley, including the Hartleys. He met her eyes steadily. I told you the man in the hallway was right. I was gathering information about how people conducted themselves, about what the families here actually were underneath the social performance. And what did you find? That your uncle borrowed against the property 3 years ago to cover a business loss he didn't disclose to your aunt, that the note comes due in November, that they have been hoping through a combination of your aunt's social management and Elizabeth Carter's considerable assets to engineer a connection to my name and my resources that would either directly or indirectly address the debt. Clara heard all of this with the flat, absorbing calm of a woman who is receiving information she already suspected and is now having confirmed. How indirectly? The Carter family's land borders mine on the east side. A marriage to Elizabeth would consolidate that boundary and generate a land agreement significant enough that Thomas Carter could afford to be generous with certain neighbors who had been, shall we say, socially useful in facilitating the connection. She absorbed this. My aunt was going to be paid for managing Elizabeth toward you. Not in those terms, but effectively yes. She sat back down on the flat stone. Not because her legs gave out, she would not give herself that, but because she needed to think, and she thought better when she wasn't standing. And Elizabeth? What does Elizabeth get? He was quiet for a moment. A very large house, and a man who would have treated her well, and felt nothing in particular for her. A pause. She gets the better end of that bargain than I do. You were going to do it, Clara said. Before all of this, you were going to choose her. I was considering it with the resigned practicality of a man who has stopped believing he will feel differently. He said it without self-pity, in the tone of a man stating a fact about a disease he'd been managing for years. And then I came here for what was supposed to be 5 days, and a woman in a stable told me that my horse didn't trust the apple. She trusted the man who brought it. Clara looked at her hands. Clara. He took one step toward her. Just one. I am not asking you to solve anything today. I am asking you to give me the chance to change the shape of this, to make the problem smaller until it isn't a problem at all. And how do you propose to do that? By being honest, he said, with everyone, starting with your aunt. She looked up sharply. You want to tell my aunt? I want to tell everyone. My friend Thomas, who helped arrange this, and is the only person who knows the truth, has been pressing me to end the survey and return. I've been delaying. He paused. I think the delay is over. Not because I've run out of time, because you deserve to stop living in a house that doesn't know what it has. Something in that sentence cracked straight through her. She pressed her lips together and looked at the creek and breathed very carefully. I need a day, she said. You have it. And I need you to understand something. She looked back at him. If you tell my aunt who you are, if this comes out, my position in that house changes. I have been useful. I will cease to be useful in the same way. And I don't know yet what replaces it. I do, he said quietly. She shook her head. Don't say it yet. Let me get to it in my own time. He pressed his lips together and nodded. One day, he said. One day, she agreed. She walked back up the road with the evening light behind her and the sound of his horse shifting on the bridge, and she thought one day to decide whether to let myself believe that the ground is solid enough to stand on. She had been testing ground for 4 years. She was very good at identifying surfaces that looked stable and weren't. This was the first time she was genuinely unsure. She spent the evening in the kitchen helping with supper, and she was so quiet that even the kitchen girl looked at her sideways. She spent the night lying on her back staring at the ceiling and having every version of the conversation she would need to have tomorrow, running each one through to its logical conclusion, examining the weight-bearing walls. Toward midnight, she stopped calculating and simply asked herself the question she had been avoiding. Do you trust him? Not is he trustworthy in the abstract. Not have his actions earned trust in principle. But you, Clara Whitfield, woman of considerable experience with people who mean well in the moment, do you trust this specific man? She lay in the dark for a long time with the question. Then she reached over and took the Bible from the nightstand and held it in her hands. The sketch was still inside it. She didn't need to look at it. She knew exactly what it showed. The garden, the oak tree, the small figure reading. The way he had seen her before she knew he was looking. Yes, she thought. God help me, yes. She put the Bible back. She closed her eyes. She slept. He came to the house the next morning. Not to the kitchen garden gate, to the front door. In the good coat on the fine horse with his card in hand, the real card, the one with his actual name on it in clean printed letters. He knocked on the front door of Ashbury Manor at 10 in the morning and asked to speak with Mrs. Hartley. Clara was in the upstairs hallway when she heard the knock. She heard Mary the housemaid open the door and then go absolutely silent for 2 full seconds, in the way people went silent when something exceeded their social processing capacity. She heard her aunt's voice from the morning room. "Who is it, Mary?" She came down the stairs, quietly reaching the bottom, just in time to see Mary present the card to Margaret, with the stunned expression of a woman who has just found out the land she's standing on has a different owner than she thought. Margaret looked at the card. She looked at it for a very long moment. Then she looked up and she saw Clara standing at the bottom of the stairs, and Clara watched her aunt's face do the full complex, devastating calculation. In real time, the survey, the gate, the mornings in the kitchen garden, the too-long extension of a 5-day job, the note under the stone at the garden gate, and she watched Margaret arrive at the answer, and she watched what the answer did to her expression. It was not rage. It was something quieter and harder. Recalculation. "Show him in," Margaret said. He came in. He stood in the Hartley morning room in his good coat with his hat in his hand, and he was not Nathan Gray. He was entirely unmistakably Nathaniel Whitmore. And Clara understood for the first time how completely she had not seen it. Not because she was foolish, but because he had been so thoroughly himself under the other name that the power and the position had simply had nowhere to appear. He looked at Clara first, just briefly a glance that said, "I am here." "I mean what I said. Hold steady." She held steady. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said in her most precisely calibrated voice. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Mrs. Hartley." He bowed. "I apologize for arriving without notice. I have something I'd like to discuss with you. About the survey." "A beat." "And about Miss Whitfield." The silence in the room was the kind that pressed. Margaret looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her aunt and said nothing. She had decided last night to say nothing until there was something to say, and then to say it clearly. "Please sit," Margaret said. He sat. He told her not all of it, but the shape of it. That he had conducted the survey personally, under an assumed name, as was his practice when assessing new property in the valley. That in the course of the survey, he had come to know Clara. That his intentions toward Clara were serious and honorable, and he was coming to her aunt first out of respect for proper process, not because Clara required her aunt's permission, but because he understood the structure of how these things were done. Margaret listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap, and her face performing a calm that Clara could see straight through. When he finished, Margaret turned to Clara. "You knew," she said. "I found out 3 days ago," Clara said. "I did not seek it. You should have told me immediately." "Yes," Clara said. "I should have. I chose to have the conversation with him first. I believe I was entitled to that." Margaret's jaw tightened fractionally. "Entitled is a strong word for your position." "I know what my position is," Clara said. "I have known it for 4 years. That is precisely why I chose to handle this myself, rather than allowing it to become another thing that was managed for me." The room went quiet. Margaret looked at her, really looked the way she rarely did without the overlay of calculation, and something moved across her face that Clara couldn't quite read. Nathaniel said quietly, "Mrs. Hartley, I want to be plain about something. My interest in Miss Whitfield has nothing to do with the household, and nothing to do with any arrangements being discussed regarding other families in the valley. I am here because she is the reason I stayed 3 times longer than I planned, and I would like the chance to pursue this properly." Margaret said, "The Carter family. The Carter family will be informed that I am withdrawing from any implied understanding," he said, firm but not cold. "That is a separate matter, which I will handle separately. I wanted to come here first." Margaret looked at Clara again, and then she did something Clara had not seen her do in 4 years. She looked at her without calculating her value. She simply looked at her. "You care for him," she said. Clara held her aunt's gaze. I am deciding whether I can trust him, she said, which is not the same thing and also not entirely different. Something passed across Margaret's face, something old and complicated. No, she said quietly. I suppose it isn't. She stood. She smoothed her dress. She looked at Nathaniel Whitmore with the measured look of a woman who understood exactly how the balance of power in this conversation was arranged and had decided how to carry it. You will call on us properly, she said, with notice. If your intentions are what you say they are, then we will conduct this the right way. That's all I'm asking, he said. She left the room. Clara stood in the morning room with Nathaniel Whitmore and listened to her aunt's footsteps go down the hallway and up the stairs, and then she let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 48 hours. That went better than I expected, he said. It went exactly as I expected, Clara said. My aunt is a pragmatic woman. She adjusts. He looked at her with that look, the one that was all attention. And you? How are you? I am... She stopped. She thought about it honestly. I am not certain yet. Ask me again in a week. I'll ask you every day if you'll let me. She looked at him. Don't push. That wasn't pushing. That was a sincere offer. It was both, she said. And you know it. He almost smiled. Yes. All right. It was both. Thomas Carter arrived at Ashbury Manor 3 days later. Not invited, not announced. He came in his best coat with the strained, too careful expression of a man who had received news he was still in the process of reacting to, and he asked to speak with Margaret privately, and Clara knew before she left the room, as requested, exactly what the conversation was going to be. She found out afterward through Edmund, who was not as careful about what he said near Clara as Margaret was. Carter is furious. Edmund told her in the kitchen, in the voice of a man who had been frightened for months and was now watching the source of the fear change shape. Says Whitmore led Elizabeth to believe. Did he? Clara said. Did he what? Lead her to believe anything specific? Or did the family do that themselves with his presence as the raw material? Edmund blinked. He looked at her, really looked the way people rarely did, and she saw him understand something. You're not wrong, he said slowly. No, she said. I'm not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he's serious about you. He says so. Do you believe him? She looked at her uncle, this tired, indebted, decent man, who had never quite had the spine to push back against his wife's management of their lives, and had been paying for it in gray hair and brandy, and the look of a man carrying something heavy. I'm getting there, she said. Edmund nodded slowly. Your father would have been... He stopped, started again. He would have said you deserved better than this house gave you. Clara held very still. In 4 years, nobody had said her father's name in anything but the most practical administrative sense. He would have been right, she said. Edmund looked at his hands. I know, he said. I know that. She left him sitting at the kitchen table, and she went upstairs, and she stood in the hallway outside her room, and pressed her back against the wall, and breathed in and out until the feeling behind her sternum settled into something she could carry. Nathaniel came the next day. Properly as Margaret had stipulated, front door calling card hat in hand, the formal machinery of appropriate courtship. Margaret received him in the parlor and stayed precisely long enough to satisfy propriety. And then she found a reason to be in the morning room, which Clara recognized as the most deliberate social exit she had ever witnessed. They sat in the parlor, Nathaniel and Clara, with the door half open and the sound of the house around them. The Carter family, Clara said, is being managed, he said, by me, personally. I spoke with Thomas yesterday. And Elizabeth, he said with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words with surgical precision, is 18 years old and considerably more resilient than her father is giving her credit for. I had a very honest conversation with her. He paused. She cried for about 10 minutes, and then told me she had always thought I was somewhat intimidating, and she was in fact relieved. Clara looked at him. "You're serious?" "Completely." Her exact words were, and I am quoting, because they deserve to be quoted, "You are very tall, and you never seem to enjoy anything, and I wasn't sure I was up to the task." Clara pressed her lips together hard to keep from laughing. "She sounds like a sensible girl." "She is. She's going to be fine." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that there is nothing to be resolved on that front. There was never an understanding. Her father pushed further than I had invited." "I know," Clara said. "I also know that if I hadn't been here, if the survey had been what it was supposed to be, you would have let it continue until it became a formal expectation." He was quiet. "Probably," he said, "because I had stopped expecting anything else. And now—" He looked at her steadily. "Now I expect considerably more." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, a horse shifted in the paddock, probably Prudence, who had opinions about the afternoon heat. "I'm not going to be easy," Clara said. "I want you to know that plainly. I am not going to be gracious and agreeable and easy, because you are who you are, and the social pressure in that direction is considerable." "I know. I will argue with you. I'm counting on it. I will tell you when you're wrong." "Clara." He leaned forward slightly. "The first thing you said to me, the very first thing in the stable with Prudence, was that she didn't need someone to give her orders. She needed someone to earn her trust." He paused. "I have been trying to figure out how to be that person ever since, and I am aware I am behind because I started badly, but I want to get there." She looked at him. She thought about the sketch in the Bible. She thought about, "That's not right," two words that had mattered more than everything. She thought about a man who extended a 5-day survey to 2 weeks because he couldn't find a way to leave. "You're going to have to earn it," she said. "Properly. Not with the land or the name. Just you. The way you actually are." "That's all I want to be," he said. "Then we'll see," she said. "We'll see how you are." The weeks that followed had a particular quality. Clara had no previous experience with the quality of something real being built carefully with attention to the load-bearing parts. He came 3 times a week, always with proper notice, always at the time he said he would come. He brought nothing extravagant, once a book he thought she'd like, once a cutting from an unusual herb. His housekeeper had said was good in bread once, nothing at all. Just himself and his hat, and the surveyor's journal which he had started using to write things other than measurements. He asked her things. Not the calibrated questions of the survey, the questions of a man who was learning a person because he wanted to know them. What had she read that she disagreed with? What she thought about the drought's effect on the southern farms? Whether she believed a woman was capable of managing a large property alone? She said yes to the last one without hesitation, and he nodded like she'd confirmed something he already knew. She asked him things too. About the plantation, about how he made decisions, about what he had learned from his father's way of doing things and what he had chosen to do differently, about what he was afraid of. He said, becoming the kind of man who owns everything and understands nothing. She said, "You're already afraid of it. That's different from being it." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read more precisely, the one that meant something she said had landed in a place he'd been trying to reach himself. "You are very good," he said, "at saying the true thing simply." "I've had a lot of practice," she said. Nobody was listening, so I had to make the sentences efficient. He pressed his lips together. She watched him hold something back, not laughter exactly, but something close, something warm. "I'm listening now," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still talking." The blow came from a direction she had not anticipated. It was Margaret who told her on a Tuesday with the careful precision of a woman delivering news she had been carrying for several days and had not known how to put down. She called Clara into the morning room. She closed the door. She sat across from her niece with her hands folded and the expression of a person who has made a decision and is now honoring it. "I have had a letter," she said. From a cousin of your late father's, in Philadelphia. Clara went very still. She has been tracking some financial matters. From your father's estate. Margaret paused. There was a debt your father had. To a business partner. The partner died 3 years ago, and the debt was believed to be resolved. She set her hands flat on her knees. It was not resolved. The partner's son has revived the claim, against your father's estate, which means against you. Clara heard this with the strange underwater quality that very bad news sometimes had, where the words arrived in the right order, but the meaning took a moment to assemble. How much? Margaret told her. It was more than she had earned in 4 years of useful work. It was more than she was likely to earn in the next 4. It was, she understood in a cold, clear way, the kind of number that could rearrange her entire future. I see, she said. Clara, I need a moment. She stood. She went to the window. She looked out at the kitchen garden, the rosemary, the beans, the north fence line, and she thought about all the ways this changed things. Because it changed things. A woman with a debt claim against her name was not a woman in a position to accept courtship from the wealthiest man in the valley. A woman with this particular hanging over her was a woman who would be seen by everyone who mattered as someone with a motive. She thought about what Nathaniel had said, about women who pursued him for his name and his land, about not being able to trust what he heard. She thought, I cannot let him find out like this. I cannot let him find out from anyone but me. When did you receive this letter? She asked. 4 days ago, Margaret said with a note of something that wasn't quite guilt, but adjacent to it. 4 days. Clara looked at her aunt. You waited 4 days. Margaret stopped. She straightened. I was trying to determine the best approach. The best approach for whom? Margaret held her gaze. For you, she said quietly and firmly. I was trying to think about what was best for you. Clara looked at her aunt, this woman who had taken her in without warmth and housed her without welcome and called her useful, and who was now sitting with her hands flat on her knees and her face doing something complicated that looked, if Clara had to name it, like remorse. I believe you, Clara said. That surprises me, but I believe you. Margaret said nothing. She looked at her hands. I need to tell him, Clara said. I thought you would say that. Today, before it gets to him another way. Yes? Margaret looked up. I thought that too. Clara left the morning room. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed for exactly 4 minutes. She counted, and then she stood up, and she put on her hat, and she went downstairs, and she sent the stable boy to Whitmore Plantation with a message that asked in the simplest possible terms whether Mr. Whitmore might be available to meet at the creek bridge that afternoon. The answer came back within the hour. 1 word. Yes. He was there before her this time. He was standing on the bridge with his arms resting on the railing, looking at the creek, the way people looked at moving water when they were waiting for something, and the waiting had gotten into their posture. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his face shifted not alarm, but attention, the immediate sharpening she had come to recognize as the way he responded to her specifically. You sent for me, he said. I have something to tell you, she said, and I need to tell you before someone else does, because if someone else does, I won't be able to see clearly what it does to you, and I need to see clearly. He turned fully toward her. All right, she told him. The letter, the debt, the number, the timing. She told him without softening it, or framing it, or managing it, the way she had learned to tell true things flat and complete, with nothing added to make it easier to receive. When she finished, he was quiet. Say something, she said. I'm thinking. About whether this changes things. He looked at her. No. About how to address it. She blinked. She had prepared herself for several responses. That one was not among them. I'm not asking you to address it. I know you're not. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, not because I want. Clara, He stepped toward her, not closing the distance entirely, leaving her space as he always did, as she had noticed he always did, giving her room to hold her ground. "Do you know what I thought when you told me?" She waited. "I thought she came to me, before anyone else. She could have said nothing, or found a way around it, or decided it wasn't my concern. And she came to me, and told me the whole of it." He held her gaze. "Do you know what that tells me?" "It tells you I don't want to be a strategy," she said. "Even my own." "It tells me," he said, "that you trust me." She stood very still. "You do," he said. "You came here because you trust me enough to show me something that could change what I think of your position. You trusted me with the part that made you vulnerable. That is Clara, that is not a small thing." She felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She had been so focused on delivering the information cleanly that she hadn't thought about what the act of delivering it meant. "The debt is real," she said. "Whatever I trust you with, the debt is still real." "Yes," he said it simply. "And it can be resolved. That is a practical matter with a practical solution, and the fact that you have it does not change a single thing about who you are or what I think of you. People will say what they say." His voice was steady and final. "I stopped making decisions based on what people would say approximately 2 weeks into a survey I extended indefinitely because I couldn't find a reason to leave that I believed in." He paused. "I have found considerable reason to stay." She looked at him. She thought about the 4 years behind her, the useful years, the invisible years, the years of making things run and being thanked in no particular way, and learning to need very little because little was what was available. She thought about what it had felt like in the kitchen garden to have 10 feet of comfortable silence with another human being. She thought this is the moment where you decide whether the ground is solid. She had been testing it for weeks. She had surveyed it from every angle, the way he surveyed land, looking for rot, looking for flood damage, looking for the places where the surface looked stable and wasn't. And what she had found every time was that when she pushed, he held. When she needed space, he gave it. When she showed him something real, he didn't flinch. "Nathan," she said. The old name. She watched him absorb it. "Yes," he said. "I don't want to be a strategy," she said. "Not yours, not my aunt's, not my own. I just want to be Clara, whatever that means, whoever that is. I want to be that, and I want that to be enough." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said simply, "It's everything." The creek moved below them. The summer afternoon pressed warm and still around them. Clara stood on the bridge and looked at the man who had called himself Nathan Gray and memorized fence posts and drawn her in the corner of a garden sketch and come to her aunt's front door in his real name with his hat in his hand, and she thought, "I have been so careful for so long." She took one step toward him. It was a small step. The bridge wasn't wide, but she closed half the distance between them, and she held his gaze and she said, "Ask me again. What you asked me at the gate that day, about giving you something to follow through on." His eyes were very steady. "What do you want, Clara? What do you actually want?" "This," she said. "Whatever this is. I want to find out what this is." He reached out carefully the way he did everything, leaving her room to step back, and he took her hand. Not dramatically, just held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. "Then we'll find out," he said. She looked down at their joined hands, her rough, useful, overlooked hands held in his, and she thought about all the things she had told herself she could not afford to want, and she thought about the fact that she was standing here wanting them anyway, and she thought that maybe the wanting was not the mistake. Maybe the mistake had been the not wanting. The creek ran below them, and the summer held, and Clara Whitfield stood on a bridge in the valley that had never claimed her, and made the deliberate, careful, terrifying decision to let herself be claimed by something she chose. That was different from everything that had come before. That was hers. She held his hand on that bridge for exactly long enough to know she meant it. Then she let go, because that was who she was, a woman who felt things completely, and then stepped back to make sure she still had her footing before she went any further. He understood. She could see it in the way he didn't try to hold on, the way he let her step back without making it mean something it didn't. That was the thing about him she kept returning to. He understood the difference between holding on and holding space. She walked back to Ashbury Manor in the early evening light, and she felt for the first time in 4 years like the ground under her feet was actually where she had put it. It lasted 2 days. The letter from Philadelphia arrived on Thursday morning, addressed not to Clara and not to Margaret, but to Edmund, which was how Clara knew it was the legal version, the one with teeth. She was in the hallway when Edmund came out of his study with the letter in his hand and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has just confirmed a fear he'd been managing in private. He saw her. He stopped. "You know," he said, "Margaret told me Tuesday." He looked at the letter. "The son is pressing it formally. He has representation." He paused. "In Richmond." Richmond meant serious. Richmond meant a man who had hired someone who knew how courts in this state operated and intended to use that knowledge. Clara stood in the hallway and felt the cold, clear shape of it settle over her. "How long do I have?" 60 days before a formal hearing is required. 60 days. She ran the arithmetic automatically, the way she ran all practical calculations quickly without sentiment. 60 days meant she needed to either find the money, find a legal challenge to the claim, or find someone who knew how to do one of those things and trusted her enough to help her do it. She knew one person who met all 3 criteria. She also knew that going to him now with 60 days on a debt claim hanging over her, 2 days after she had stood on a bridge and held his hand, would look to every person watching like exactly what she had promised herself she would never be. A strategy. She went to her room. She sat on the bed. She picked up the Bible and held it without opening it, and she thought about the conversation on the bridge. "I don't want to be a strategy. Not yours. Not my aunt's. Not my own." She had meant every word. She meant it now, which meant she could not go to him about the letter. Not yet. Not until she had exhausted every other option first. She put the Bible down. She went to Edmund's study, and she knocked, and she sat across from her uncle, and she asked him to tell her everything about the original debt, every detail he knew, every name attached to it, the full history of what her father had borrowed, and from whom, and under what terms. Edmund told her. It took an hour. When he finished, he looked at her with the tired, complicated look of a man recognizing something in someone he should have recognized long before. "You're going to try to fight it yourself," he said. "I'm going to understand it first," she said. "And then I'm going to decide." "Clara," he leaned forward. "Your father's business partner, the man who made the original loan. His name was Aldridge." She went very still. "Richard Aldridge. His father. Senior. He died 3 years ago." Edmund's voice was careful. "His son is the one pressing the claim. Young Aldridge. The one who just came back from Boston." She stood up slowly. She thought about the dinner party, about the Aldridge family, about the son she had barely registered, about her aunt, making the social rounds. She thought about how small this valley was, and how old its grudges were, and how thoroughly she had been for 4 years not paying attention to the machinery of it, because she had been too busy being useful to the people running it. "This is not an accident," she said. "No," Edmund said quietly. "I don't believe it is." She found out the rest in pieces the way you found out things in a small valley where everyone knew everything and nobody said it directly. She asked careful questions of the kitchen girl who had a sister who worked for the Pembertons, and she listened to Margaret's conversations with more attention than she let show. And she went to the lending library in town on an errand Margaret gave her, and she read for 2 hours everything she could find about property debt claims in Virginia and the legal processes attached to them. What she found was this: the claim was real. The original debt was documented. But there was a question, a genuine legal question, about whether the debt transferred to the heir when the heir had not been named in the original agreement. The partnership had been between her father and Richard Aldridge Sr. It had not been contracted to pass to issue on either side. That was a crack in the foundation of the claim. A small one, but a crack. She needed a lawyer. She needed a lawyer in 60 days, and she needed one who would take the case from a woman with no money and the full understanding that if she won, she still had no money, which meant she needed someone who would take it on principle, or on deferred terms, or on the very slim chance that she could eventually pay. She thought about this for 3 days, turning the problem over the way she turned all problems methodically, without panic, looking for the load-bearing solution. On the third day, Nathaniel came for his regular call. She had been managing him carefully all week present, warm, honest, but not telling him about the letter. She had made herself a promise, and she intended to keep it. She would find her own footing on this before she told him. She would not arrive at his door with a crisis as her calling card. But he looked at her for approximately 4 minutes in the parlor that afternoon, and then he said, "Something happened. I'm fine." "Clara," I said, "I'm fine." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "You have the same expression you had when you told me about the garden party," he said. "The one where you've decided to carry something alone because you don't trust that anyone will carry it with you." She opened her mouth. She closed it. "I'm not asking you to tell me," he said. "I'm telling you what I see. What you do with that is your business." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought, he is doing it again. He is leaving me the space to choose. And she thought, I came to the bridge 2 days ago, and I said I wanted to find out what this is. This right here, this moment, this is part of what it is. "The debt claim has gone formal," she said. "There's a hearing date in 60 days. He did not react with alarm. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, with that steady taking stock attention. "The Aldridge son," he said. She blinked. "You know, I've been aware of the claim for about a week. I was waiting for you to tell me." He met her eyes. "I wasn't going to bring it to you. I was waiting to see how you handled it." The heat that moved through her at that sentence was immediate and complicated. Not quite anger, not quite relief, something that held both at once. "You were testing me." "No," he said it firmly. "I was respecting you. There is a difference. I knew you'd find the best path to it. I didn't want to be the person who took that from you." She pressed her lips together hard. "I have found a legal argument," she said, "about the transfer of partnership debts to heirs not named in the original agreement." He was very still. "You found that yourself?" "I went to the lending library." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely hold. "And you need a lawyer." "I need a lawyer who will take the case without payment in advance." She kept her voice even. "I am not asking you to pay for it. I'm telling you the situation because I told you I would tell you true things. That's all." "I have a lawyer," he said. "In Richmond. One of the best in the state. He owes me a professional courtesy. I'd like to send him the details of the claim." "Nathaniel, I'm not paying for it," he said. "I'm making an introduction. What you do with the introduction is your business. His fee, if there is one, is yours to arrange." A pause. "But I don't think there will be one, because once he reads the partnership agreement, he's going to see the same crack you saw, and he's going to want to argue it." She looked at him. "How do you know I saw a crack?" "Because you've been calm for 3 days. You're only calm when you have something to work with." She held his gaze. She thought about the sketch in the Bible. She thought about, "I saw you from the first night." She thought about a man who had spent a week knowing about the debt claim and said nothing because he was waiting for her to find her own way to it. "You are a very strange man," she said. "I've been told. I mean that as a compliment." "I know," he said. "That's why I'll take it." The lawyer's name was Mr. James Hartwell, and he arrived from Richmond 12 days later with a briefcase full of documents and the particular energy of a man who had found an argument he intended to win. He met with Clara first, not with Nathaniel, not with Edmund, but with Clara at her specific request in the Hartley morning room with a pot of tea she had made herself and her own notes from the lending library spread on the table. He looked at her notes for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. "Who helped you prepare these?" "I prepared them myself," she said. He looked at the notes again. "You have legal training." "I have access to a lending library and the capacity to read without stopping." He set the notes down. He looked at her steadily. "Miss Whitfield, the argument you've identified is sound. It is not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed, but it is sound. Where did you learn to read a partnership agreement?" "My father was a businessman," she said. "He used to talk through his contracts at dinner. I paid attention." "Most young women do not pay attention to contracts at dinner. Most young women are not told they will be useful rather than welcome," she said. "You develop different skills depending on what you're told you are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to take this case, not as a professional courtesy to Mr. Whitmore." He tapped her notes. "Because of these." Something loosened in her chest carefully, precisely like a knot being worked free, one strand at a time. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. We have 60 days. Then we had better start." The hearing in Richmond was set for the 49th day. Clara went. Edmund went with her, which surprised her, and Margaret gave her the good traveling dress without being asked, which surprised her more. Nathaniel did not come with her. She had asked him not to. "If you are there," she had said, "people will see you there, and they will conclude that you are why I won. I need to be why I won." He had looked at her for a long moment and said, "You will win." "I know," she said, "but I need to be the one who does it." He had nodded and stepped back and let her go, which was exactly what she needed him to do, and exactly what she had known by then that he would do. Mr. Hartwell argued the case for 3 hours. Clara sat behind the bar with her hands folded and her face still, and she listened to the legal machinery of it. The claim, the counter-argument, the precedent from a Massachusetts case in 1809 that Hartwell had found, and that applied with elegant precision to the question of partnership debt and hereditary transfer. Young Aldridge's lawyer pushed back. He was good. He was not, Clara thought, as good as Hartwell, and he had not spent 12 days working with a client who had read every document 4 times and could identify the weaknesses in the original agreement from memory. The panel deliberated for 2 hours. They found in Clara's favor. She sat in the hearing room when they announced it, and she did not cry, and she did not make a sound. She sat with her hands folded, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she felt not triumph exactly, something quieter and deeper. The feeling of a woman who has been told for years that she is not the kind of person things go right for discovering that she was wrong about that all along. Edmund put his hand on her arm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked at Hartwell across the room, and she nodded once, and he nodded back, and that was enough. She told Nathaniel that evening at the Creek Bridge, because that was where they had started telling each other true things, and it seemed right to tell this one there. She told him simply, "They won. The claim is dismissed. It's over." He looked at her for a long moment. "How do you feel?" "Like myself," she said. "For the first time in a long time. Like the version of myself I thought I was going to be before things went the way they went." "Who is that person?" he asked. "Someone who doesn't need to be useful to justify her presence," she said. "Someone who can just be. And that's enough." He was quiet. He looked at the creek. "Clara," he said, "I would like to ask you something." She looked at him. She knew what was coming, had known it was coming, had been carrying the knowledge of its approach, the way you carried the knowledge of a season, changing something inevitable and not unwelcome. "All right," she said. "I would like to ask you properly, with full knowledge of who you are and what this is, and exactly what I'm asking." He turned to face her. He was not holding his hat. He had stopped holding his hat around her approximately 3 weeks ago, which she had noticed and taken to mean something. "I am not asking because of the land or the name or the position. I am asking because you are the only person I have ever met who told me the truth before she knew it could benefit her, and I have been trying to figure out how to be worth that ever since." She looked at him. The man who had held his hat and drawn her in a garden and said that's not right and waited and kept waiting because she needed him to. Ask me, she said. Will you marry me? He said. Not as a resolution to anything, not as a strategy or a social arrangement, as the one thing I actually want, which is to spend my life being someone you consider worth talking to. She held his gaze. She thought about the stable and the apple. She thought about Prudence pressing her nose against her shoulder in the dark. She thought about 10 feet of comfortable silence and a small figure reading under an oak tree, and 2 words that's not right, landing harder than anything elegant she had ever been told. She thought about the kitchen garden and the mending and 4 years of being useful and the lending library and the hearing room and the feeling of being exactly herself. She thought, this is solid ground. I have tested every beam. This holds. Yes, she said. Just the one word. Clean and final and entirely her own. He reached for her hand slowly the way he always did leaving her room, and she gave it to him without hesitation, and this time she did not let go. They were married in September, not at Whitmore Plantation, which was where everyone expected it. Not in the largest church in the county, which was where Margaret wanted it. In the small white church at the edge of Whitmore Valley, the one that held 80 people if they sat close with the windows open to let in the early fall air and the sound of the creek in the distance. Edmund walked her down the aisle. He was not her father, and they both knew it, but he walked beside her with a straightness in his shoulders that she had not seen in years, and when he placed her hand in Nathaniel's, his grip was steady. Margaret sat in the first pew and did not weep because Margaret never wept in public. But Clara watched her press her handkerchief once briefly to the corner of her eye, and she found she did not mind. Mr. Hartwell was there. He had brought his wife, who looked at Clara with the direct appraising look of a woman who respected competence. Thomas Carter was there, not warmly, not yet, but present and correct, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Elizabeth Carter sat beside her father, in a dress that was yellow again, and when she caught Clara's eye, she smiled. Not the calibrated social smile, but a real one, small and genuine, the smile of a girl who had landed on her feet and was glad to see someone else do the same. Nathaniel stood at the front of the church and watched Clara walk toward him, and she could see from 20 feet away that he had stopped performing anything. He was just there, present, his face entirely open in the way it was only when it was only her. She walked the whole length of that aisle looking at him, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone sees you. Not the version you perform, the actual you. The vows were brief and plain. They had chosen them together in the parlor at Ashbury Manor one afternoon, and they had cut away everything ceremonial until only the true parts were left. To love honestly, to speak plainly, to hold space and to hold on both, and to know the difference. When Nathaniel said, "I will," his voice did not shake. When Clara said it, hers did not either. She had come too far to shake now. Voik. The night after the wedding, they walked to the kitchen garden at Ashbury Manor, because Clara had wanted to see it once more before she left. Not from sentiment exactly, but from the need to stand in the place where things had changed and acknowledge the change from the inside of it. He stood at the gate, and she stood in the garden with her feet in the dirt between the bean rows, and she looked at the oak tree in the corner where the wall met the shade. "The sketch," she said, "the one you drew. Is it accurate, do you think?" "Reasonably," he said. "It was drawn from about here." He gestured to the gate where he was standing. "You were standing at the gate." "I was surveying the north line." "You were watching me." "Yes," he said. "I was watching you." She looked at the oak tree for a moment longer. Then she crossed the garden and came to the gate and stood in front of him. And she looked at the man she had married, and she thought about every version of herself that had stood in this garden. The invisible one, the useful one, the careful one. The one who had decided at 4 o'clock on a Thursday that trouble might be worth it. "I want a garden at Whitmore," she said. "My own, not the formal one, something I can put my hands in." "It's already yours," he said. "Everything is already yours." "Nathaniel." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need everything. I just need what's mine." He looked back at her. This man who had learned was still learning the difference between giving a woman everything and letting her keep herself. "Then keep it," he said. "All of it. I'm not asking you to put anything down." She stepped through the gate. She took his arm. They walked back toward the house together in the September evening, and the valley was quiet around them, and the creek ran somewhere in the distance, and Prudence was in the paddock, probably investigating something she had no business investigating, and Clara Whitfield, who was Clara Whitmore now, though she would always know which name she had been given and which name she had chosen, walked beside the man she had trusted with the most difficult thing a careful woman could trust anyone with. Not her hand, not her future, her actual self. She had arrived in this valley 4 years ago with a Bible and a gray dress and a letter that said she would be useful. She had stood in hallways and served at tables and fixed chrysanthemums that leaned to the left and folded sheets that did not need folding and learned to disappear while still being present. And then a man had come to a stable with an apple in his pocket and looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room, and she had spent 6 months deciding whether to believe him, and she had tested every beam and checked every post and read every document twice and stood in a hearing room in Richmond and won the first fight that had ever been entirely hers to win. And she had found that the ground was solid, that she was solid, that a woman who had been told she would be useful had turned out to be something far more permanent than useful. She was necessary and chosen and seen and her own. The greatest fortune she had once thought was not the land you owned, but the heart that chose you when you had nothing to offer. She had been right about that. But she knew now what she had not known then, that the greater fortune still was this, to finally believe all the way down to the foundation of yourself that you were worth choosing. Clara Whitmore believed it, without qualification, without remainder. And that, at last, was everything.